Warning: this episode contains brain food that will lead to improved emotional and social intelligence. Hello and welcome to More Mental Fitness by Harvesting Happiness with me, Lisa Cypers-Kamen. We are committed to delivering sound ideas for better well-being. This bonus edition of the Good Citizens Election Season Survival Guide has been created in partnership with an incredible group of contributors who support critical thinking, intelligent voting, and relational pleasure for a happier, healthier, and more productive society. Alrighty then, let's dive in. Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening wherever you are. Thanks for joining me today on this special edition of the Good Citizens Election Season Survival Guide, helping to restore common sense in a crazy world. On today's show, we are talking about critical thinking, anxiety, and mental health, a philosophical approach. My guest today is Samir Chopra. Samir is a philosophical counselor and professor emeritus of philosophy at Brooklyn College and the Graduate Center of the City University of New York. He has authored and co-authored several books, including works on film, artificial intelligence, and sports. Samir is a champion of critical thinking who helps others find their way to manage anxiety and mental health through a philosophical approach. His most recent book is entitled Anxiety, a Philosophical Guide. Samir, thanks for coming back. Thanks for agreeing to chat more about the positive uses, the redirection of anxiety, and how we can make some sense of it.
Thanks so much for having me on. It's great to be back here.
So your latest book, which I have to say I gave to my daughter as a gift, and she was quite pleased with it. So thank you for that.
Thank you.
Philosophical reflection, how can it aid in our political activity? And moreover, what I'm really asking is we're headed into a bumpy few months, at least in the United States, as we enter the election cycle and the results of the election. And I'm wondering how we might be able to regain a sense of control, a locus of control over ourselves when everything seems seemingly out of control.
Thanks, Lisa. You've asked a really rich question there, which has many different parts to it. So I'll try to do justice to all of them. I think, first of all, just real quick, thanks for mentioning my book on anxiety, which just came out this past March. And, when we talked earlier about that book, which purports to be a philosophical guide to anxiety, one of the points I had sort of made in there in accepting the fact that we would live with anxiety is that anxiety often is a kind of signal to us about the kinds of things that we're concerned about, right? So if I'm concerned about the fate of something, or very often my own fate, my own possibilities in the future, then I will have anxiety about that thing because I also know that I do not have perfect control over the outcome, right? So there is a philosophical, I would say, approach to all of this, one of which is to gain an understanding of the phenomena that one is grappling with, to be able to reflect critically upon it, to make informed choices with respect to it. And perhaps in the final analysis, when all is said and done and the outcomes have obtained, to, as it were, accept those outcomes, whatever they may be, and to accept them with resilience and to move on. Not so much, I would say, with resignation, but as with a kind of acceptance and integration of who we are as citizens, right? So, if we are doing politics, we're always in contestation. We're always competing for political goods. We're trying to secure those political goods for each other. So there is an element of agon, right? What the Greeks call agon. There is a contest in there. We are trying to, as it were, get political goods, perhaps at the cost of our opponents. So that means we must understand the contest we are in and also accept its outcome. Part of this, I think, is coming to accept that we are very concerned about the outcome. If you, for example, think about the elections that are coming up in our nation, we are about to elect a very powerful person who will have control of giant amounts of money, wealth, resources, weapons at their disposal. They'll make policies that will affect all our lives, right down to their most minute details, right? Decisions pertaining all the way from personal health care to the maintenance of the environment. These are very critical decisions. I'm a parent. My child is to be sent forth into this world that will be determined by the politics of the modern era, right? So I think there are several ways in which I think philosophy and philosophical reflection can aid us as citizens and as activists. I think first and foremost is it should make us curious. I think being philosophical and being curious are very much one and the same thing. We shouldn't be complacent. We shouldn't be self-satisfied. We should actively go out and look for answers to the kinds of questions we have. We should raise questions and we should answer and attempt to answer them of candidates, their platforms, interrogate them, so to speak. I think it's worth remembering in politics, we are the ones in power. We get to ask the questions, right?
Well, they
The
work for
politicians are there
us.
to answer them, right?
Ultimately, we do forget that politicians work for us. We're actually the employer.
Yes, it says so in their titles, public servants.
Yes,
You
we
know,
forget.
it says so quite explicitly,
Yeah.
right? So we are conducting a ginormous interview, and we would like the candidates to come before us and to answer the questions we put to them. But we should know what kinds of questions to ask. And in order to ask those questions, we have to have done our history, we have to have done our reading, we have to be reading the newspapers every day, we have to be interrogating the various sources of information we get, and I think this is where critical thinking and philosophical reflection makes one of its most important appearances. How are we to critically evaluate the glut of information that we are confronted with on a day-to-day basis?
This is really
Right.
important because a lot of information is inaccurate, purposefully inaccurate,
Right.
and it's up to the consumer to tease out what is real versus not. No one's going to say this is fake news. No one's going to put a little warning label on what we get out there. So
Right.
the reality testing of what we see and read, what we consume is really important. And
Very
how do
much
we
so.
ask those questions?
Very much so. And Lisa, I really don't think there's any shortcuts in this domain,
Yeah.
because I think that task of being a critical assessor of information begins pretty much from the cradle. It begins with our most basic primary and elementary systems of education, with the kinds of books and curricula we expose our children to, with the amount of reading we expect of them. The
Yeah.
only way that a child can grow up to think, to ask, what source of information is this information coming from, and how good is that source of information, can only come from someone who's already quite well informed. You see, for a child to know that a claim about geology being made by the National Geographic Society counts for more than one made by the National Enquirer already assumes that the child in question knows the difference between the
Yes.
National Geographic and the National Enquirer, which is already a valuable piece of cultural knowledge to be working with. That this is an esteemed source of information about the domain of science, right? That's
Yeah.
another critical part, that there's a particular domain that it's good about. Not just that it's a good source of information, but that it's good about this particular domain, right?
Well, the citation is not enough. The source of the
Yes,
citation is
that's right. Where did
and
it come from,
where did it come
right?
from?
What does it mean for it to be corroborated by other sources of information that are also good,
Yeah.
right? The fact that knowledge comes to us from a certain sort of interlinking network whose nodes reinforce each other, and that pieces of information get their credibility based on which other credible pieces of information reinforce them. This is a fairly sophisticated piece of cultural knowledge, and something that
Yeah.
children have to be slowly socialized into through our schools, right?
But there are parts of our country where critical thinking is not taught in the classroom, where resources from which we pool or collect our opinions might not necessarily be accurate. So, because the United States, for example, is so large and so vast and so different, and in a certain sense, like countries within a country, this is part of the challenge, right? To get people to agree on what is a rational, reasonable, reliable piece of information.
Sure. I think those variances do exist. We have, as you pointed out, a patchwork system of public education,
Yeah.
which is administered. And I think the challenge is in understanding the effect that it has had on our public knowledge levels, I think is documented well. The source of quite sustained critique. I think what we now, given that as the electorate that we have to work with, still need to insist in some ways in the kind of discourse that we have at large, that we not accept pieces of knowledge given to us uncritically, that we learn to investigate the sources that those make those sorts of claims, and in some sense to build into the way that we conduct political dialogue a certain kind of healthy skepticism about the kinds of claims that are being made.
And I think it's also reasonable to expect an answer to the questions. Like, you don't answer the question with another question. You don't, the rhetoric is actually not addressing the
Yes.
issue.
Right. Right. I think that word that you mentioned, rhetoric, political rhetoric, I think understanding how it works, what its components are, the various kinds of argumentative devices and techniques that can be used by speakers when conveying information to us, how we are to recognize them, how we are to recognize, for example, various modes of reasoning that employ fallacies, right? For example, when politicians confront us with false dichotomies, when they make it seem like there's only two options that are available as a solution to a problem, and so if I'm rejecting one, I must necessarily be as it were propounding the second one, right? These elementary fallacies of reasoning, right? These noticing certain kinds of argumentative or rhetorical techniques that politicians might use, and becoming skilled at recognizing them and the effects that they have on political discourse. I think this is a very important part of our participation as citizens in this particular political cycle.
Earlier, you spoke about being skeptical, and which really leads me to think about how we ask questions and not being afraid to ask questions, especially from people who might hold beliefs that are different from our own. Because my sense, I'm going to speak of my own experiences, when I inquire in that way, I find out that their positions, their needs, their desires are generally not different than mine. That we all pretty much want the same thing for our lives and the lives of our families.
I think when I say being skeptical, we could even replace it with a slightly gentler term, which is that in our political doors, in our political discourse, in our interactions with other political citizens and subjects, in the course of having political discussions, it is always reasonable to ask fellow citizens for reasons for their political stances.
Yeah.
Why do you hold the beliefs that you do? Why do you hold the opinions that you do? It is always reasonable to ask them why they believe in something. What are their grounds for believing in something? What are their justifications for believing in something? Simply by asking people for reasons and beliefs, for their beliefs and their values, asking them for reasons and justifications, we make their political stances transparent to us. More importantly, I think we end up making their political stances transparent to people themselves.
Yeah.
Because when people have their stances interrogated or questioned or clarified, they might sometimes learn something about themselves as well, right? Which is something that we always have to be open to, right? I mean, I would say actually in my counseling work, when I'm asking people what they believe, what they value, this is in the ends of making people self-transparent to themselves, right? Why do I do the things that I do?
Yeah.
Right? Because I believe in certain things, because I value certain things. That's why I do or take these actions, right? And sometimes that greater self-understanding is something that is of value in helping us understand why I live the life that I do, why I feel the way that I do, why I make certain kinds of political commitments and not others, right?
I also think there's something in the asking, in the inquiry, some unspoken, right? A meta message that when I take the time to ask you about your beliefs in a sincere way, I mean, not
Very
to
much so.
to mock you, but say I want to understand. It hits at the core part of our humanity, right? Which is connection and belonging, which is
Very
part of
much
what is
so.
driving this whole polarization.
Very much so. Lisa, that's a really, really deep point, because if you think about it, the heart and soul of any kind of therapeutic work that you do, right? As a
Yes.
psychotherapist, counselor, psychoanalyst, whatever, is that you make the person who has come to you seeking for help feel seen and feel heard.
Yeah.
Regardless of any kind of theoretical orientation you might have. You might be Gestalt, you might be Freudian, you might be Jungian, Kleinian, whatever. It doesn't really matter.
Doesn't matter.
You need to see the person, you need to hear the other person. That's true of romantic relationships. People who fall in love with you have fallen in love with you because you have made them feel seen and heard in special ways, right? That's true of politics as well. Political connections come about, political gaps and fissures can be healed if people can achieve acceptance, commonality on things that are important to them. And that can only happen if they feel seen and heard by the other person, right?
And that's challenging for
and that's very
right
challenging.
now. It's very, very challenging.
Yeah. And by the way, I will say one thing. Political argument and political persuasion, convincing someone of a political point of view, I don't really think it happens by argument and discussion as much as it does by shared experience. Two people come to hold the same political viewpoint, not because they have discussed things necessarily with each other, but because they've come to experience something together.
I like what you just said. And I also think that this comes from understanding facts, understanding the data. But because there is so much of this disinformation out there, that when you sit down and talk about a subject with somebody who holds an opposing view, and you're able to walk them through the data from a source they can agree to, right?
Exactly.
This is not the National Enquirer. This is not the National Geographic, because we're not talking about nature. We're talking about this, and these are the facts. When you now see this information, does it change? Does it shift anything for you?
Yeah.
That's a fantastic discourse. It's satisfying.
Yes. And I think it also points out the challenges of getting to that stage, because I think one of the features of our modern discourse is that people have come to disbelieve and distrust many sources of information that they might previously have counted upon. So in fact, I think the distrust of sources has grown so great that sometimes we struggle to think of how we can find common ground and talk to people and say things like, can you and I at least agree upon the information that is coming to us from source X? Can we at least agree that what we read out here is true? Because then we can use that as a basis for further discussion. And that sometimes has become difficult for us, right? Somebody says, I don't believe in Fox, I don't believe in CNN, or, I don't believe in various sources of information, which have lost credibility for various reasons, for various good reasons.
I agree with you completely about that.
And so that has often left us feeling quite unanchored, right?
Let's take a pause, because we're in the flow together. We're blowing past our break. So let's take a pause, and we'll come back and continue the conversation with my guest today, Samir Chopra. We're talking about his book, Anxiety, A Philosophical Guide, but relating it to the election cycle and how we can manage our own anxiety, our own fear, our own uncertainty, and in relationship to others about the same. To learn more, please visit SamirChopra.com. You can also find him on psychologytoday.com, and you can look him up there, Samir Chopra in Brooklyn, New York. Here comes the pause. We all know a good night's sleep is medicine that is vital to our health and well-being. Benefits of high-quality sleep include improved immune function, reduced stress, weight maintenance, better executive functioning, mood regulation, and so much more. And yet there is one phase of sleep that most of us fail to get enough of. I'm talking about deep restorative sleep, which is responsible for most of our body's overnight restoration and repair. A big reason is magnesium deficiency, because more than 75% of the population is deficient in magnesium. Magnesium increases GABA, an important amino acid that produces a calming effect and encourages relaxation on a cellular level, which is critical for rejuvenating sleep. Magnesium also plays a key role in regulating our body's stress response system. Those with magnesium deficiency usually experience higher stress, anxiety, and fear levels that can negatively impact sleep patterns. Before you go out and buy just any magnesium supplement, it's important to understand that most products out there only have 1 to 2 forms of magnesium when our bodies need all 7 forms of this essential mineral for optimal benefits and help with restorative sleep. That's why I use and recommend Bioptimizer's Magnesium Breakthrough. It helps me to power down and ease into restorative sleep so that I can take on the next day well-rested and with more physical energy and mental clarity. Magnesium Breakthrough is the only organic full-spectrum magnesium that contains all 7 forms of magnesium, designed to help calm the mind and body, to help fall asleep, stay asleep, and wake up refreshed. It's a drug-free chill pill that's legal and works. No more tossing and turning here. The deep sleep benefits are noticeable and deeply appreciated. Nourish your mind and body with this all-natural, full-spectrum magnesium supplement. Bioptimizer's Magnesium Breakthrough is a game changer. Go to bioptimizers.com/happiness and use promo code happiness during checkout to save 10%. Subscribe to receive great discounts, free gifts, and a monthly supply delivered to your door. And if you're not happy, there is a 365-day money-back guarantee. Check it out at bioptimizers.com/happiness and use code happiness. Your mind and body will thank you. Now here comes the pause. We'll be right back. Harvesting happiness is rooted in science. Our work facilitates applied positive psychology practices through media and consulting. We're committed to sound ideas for better well-being, leading to increased life satisfaction and a better world for everyone. We're not into pseudoscience or quick fixes. We're all about using common sense backed by rigorous research. Healthy critical thinking is the foundation for our discussions. We encourage you to challenge preconceptions and explore ideas with a curiously discerning mind. Our collaboration is united by an inclusive vision that boosts resilience, critical thinking, communication, and problem solving through civilized discourse and pleasurable relational engagement for everyone. And we're back talking with Samir Chopra about a philosophical approach to critical thinking, anxiety, and mental health. Let's get back to it. So, Samir, let's get back to the conversation, but now focus a little bit on mental health and what happens to us when we are in this state of anxiety for an extended period of time, because it impacts everything in the way we perform.
Right. Lisa, thanks for raising that concern and that worry. That when we think about politics, anxiety is often an inevitable companion of it, because the decisions that are made in the political realm are quite so consequential for us as they are at every single aspect of our life. So we know at some level that if there is political struggle or political debate ongoing, then a great deal hinges on its outcomes, right? And all the outcomes could, how much money I make, where I live, whether I will have health care or not, whether my children will have clean drinking water and adequate food, for instance, for the future, right? These are very important questions.
Yes.
We know that the material organization of the world has a great deal of difference to make on whether I feel happy, contented, satisfied, stressed out, worried, or not, right? It makes a great deal of difference to how we organize our societies. So I would say the intersections of politics and our mental health are in some ways well known to us. We live them every single day. We could quite accurately say that my mental health is a function of our national politics as well, right? What we read, what we consume, what we see in the media every single day. This is a great determinant of whether I wake up in the mornings with a sense of optimism or with a sense of unease, right? It makes a great deal of difference what I'm watching on the nightly news, what I read in the morning newspaper, what I hear people at the bus stop discussing, right? This is part of what we might call a certain kind of almost white noise that fills up my airwaves, everything I hear all around me. It's this kind of chatter, right, which
Mm-hmm.
fills the airwaves. The content of this chatter, if it's hostile, disturbing, aggressive, loaded with anger, loaded with a great deal of dissatisfaction and discontent, that can create, I would say, something like resonant emotions within me: dissatisfaction, anger. Maybe I feel like picking up my phone and calling in a talk radio show and, losing my proverbial, top on the air, as it were. Or I might sit down angrily with my phone and write something quickly with my thumbs, right? Yell expletives at someone that I don't know all that well, who I'll never meet even,
No.
right, face to face. But it's easy to abuse them online and carry on, right? Or say something like, "This is absolute trash. You need to get a life, you jerk," and hit send and carry on, right? So, in some ways, notice we have also structured our material environment in such a ways that we can subject ourselves to a great deal of dissonant sound and fury, and we can subject others to a great deal of that dissonant sound and fury as well. If you want, you can set up your Google News stream in such a way that news of every single violent disaster around the world is delivered to your desktop,
Oof.
right? You could actually write an AI script that does that for you today,
My cortisol level just shot up. The thought of
right?
that.
I mean, this is the
Yeah.
perversity of the man-made world that we have,
Yeah.
right? Now, to navigate all of this and to do politics within this, as we are all noticing, is a challenge, right?
Well, we're preying on the brain's negativity bias. It's the inherent structure of our brain for safety, right? A system that was originally evolved to keep ourselves safe
Right.
now is prey
Yes. Yes.
to whether it's keep
To
us in
information
line or
delivered in this shape and form.
yes,
In
exactly.
this shape and form, with this emotional balance, and with this potential to direct our political action elsewhere.
Yeah.
Right.
From fear.
And from
That
fear, from
yes.
anxiety. And I think this is where anxiety and fear come into the picture, because one of the things that it does create with these weird, half-baked intimations of a future that lies ahead of us, filled with some kind of unspecified, terrible disasters, some of which are happening around us. This is, you see, the terrible thing about the world we live in is that really bad things do happen.
Yeah.
Bad
If we're
things are happening
alive,
today as we speak.
if
There
we're
are
alive,
wars happening,
we'll be
right?
they'll be suffering. I mean, this
Yeah.
is something that you talk about in your book, right?
Yes,
That
and we know this.
yes,
And
no
it's
surprise.
it's shocking for me for us to sit here and note this, but there are slaughters taking place of innocents today in the world,
Yes.
and they are happening. They are likely to happen. There are natural disasters that might happen. So we know that there are adequate fears out there that someone could also use to exploit us, right? If there are existent fears in the world, we can also talk of imagined fears.
Mm,
One great role that existent fears have always played in politics is that they serve as the raw material to construct pictures of worlds that have yet to be realized, but in which terrible things will happen unless you practice the right kind of politics, right? So, in some sense, our natural anxieties also leave us susceptible to a certain brand of political manipulation, right? Ideologies like fascism and totalitarianism have flourished in the past because politicians have come upon us. They have played upon our fears and anxieties. They have talked about glorious pasts and about these dangerous futures in which we will be swamped by the dangers that lurk amongst us. And those who have not learned their history, who are not able to evaluate such claims critically, are then susceptible
yeah.
to their fears and anxieties, are then capable of lashing out in order to address their fears and anxieties.
Well, it's from people who are different than me, right? So it's meant to divide. It's meant to
Yes,
separate and disconnect us from one another.
and to think about and to find sources of fear in those things that we do not understand, that
Yeah.
for us are unknown, that for us are incomprehensible. Fear of the unknown is perhaps the oldest human sentiment of all, and it is the one that we have commented on the most, but it remains just as relevant today, right? So if we do not know something about a particular phenomena, if we are ignorant, if we are ill informed, if we are not critically informed, we are also leaving ourselves susceptible to certain kinds of fears and anxieties which can be exploited, right? I mean, there's a reason why we use the word enlightenment as not just something that increases my knowledge about something, but that also eases my worries, right? That, that example I
Yes.
used the last time we talked about anxiety, where I walk into a dark room and I see a snake in the corner. And so I'm terrified. I freak out and I throw chairs and tables at the snake. And then somebody comes in, switches on the light, and I see it's just a rope, right?
Yeah.
Now, nothing has changed in the world except my knowledge of the situation.
Yes.
But I am less frightened. I'm less frantic. I'm less fearful. I'm less angry. I'm less terrified. I'm less likely to violently lash out because I know what it is that I'm looking at, right?
You bring up a really good point in terms of the upcoming election and its outcome, and regardless of what it is, right? Feeling disappointed or upset or more. The one thing that I don't think that we can give up on is the hope for humanity. And that regardless of what cycle we're about to come into, it is just a cycle.
Yeah.
I'm certain about that. As the more I read about history and the more I see that it is the rhyme, not the repetition that we're in, actually, I have hope.
Yes, yes. There's something quite beautiful and metaphorical about, the passage of time through a year as the seasons change and day and light and the passage of time from the frozen wastes of winter to the blossoming of spring and then the high times of summer. There's also this sense that the good and the bad, which is a very deep Buddhist
Yes.
lesson, they are both temporary and passing. That, much as we must cling to hope in moments of darkness, we have to also await the coming of darkness when things are blooming in light, because we know that this too will end. Just like happy
Yes,
times will end,
exactly.
so too will the sad. There is a perfect symmetry in this, which makes the world, imbued with both tragedy and beauty.
Which there's solace in that for
Yes,
me.
very
I
much
mean,
so.
I've spent a lot of time thinking about it because I too have a little bit of an anxiety streak. So
Yes.
I thought, well, how can I be with this? Because I want to do more than just exist, and I hope our listeners will feel as though there is hope. And regardless, this is a temporary condition. Things will change, and we can create our votes and our political activism in other ways. Not just at a national level. There are things we can do every day in our lives
Very much so.
that align with our values.
That's a good way to put it. I agree.
Because maybe that's where we can make the biggest difference.
Yeah, I actually thank you for injecting that note as a way to continue to keep that in mind, because I think, of course, like I said, we often think of politics as being struggle, contest, victory, and so on and so forth. But we also have to remember that it's also a struggle to build a community, very often with the same people with whom we are engaged in a contest with, right?
And maybe
We
that
still have to
is
live with each other.
the ahimsa, right? We were talking about that, like the way of being in the world, this nonviolent way of being, where it's not only nonviolence against others, but nonviolence against ourselves.
Yes, very much so. Very much so. Very much so. If we're not used to treating ourselves with kindness, it's far easier to fall into the habit of treating others not kindly as well. Right. So I think those two cannot be separated.
And this is a conversation to be continued, because I don't think that 30 minutes or 2 segments does it justice, but it does give me food for thought. And I hope it gives others food for thought about how they can use this way to rationalize and be proactive in their own lives as we enter this very unique period of time.
I think it's a very good note to think about, Lisa, because I just want to reiterate, we'll have an election which is posed as a contest, as of two opposing groups engaged in a battle or something of that sort with each other. But when the smoke clears, when the election ends, we will all still be left with each other.
Yes.
We'll all still, it's not as if the citizens who lose the election will be asked to leave the US. They're going to
Right.
continue.
They're not voted off the island.
They're not
As
voted
much
off
as
the island.
as much as some people might like to think that's what will happen, it's not happening.
It's like I have neighbors on my street I know who vote in a different party. They're still going to be there.
Yeah.
We're still going to be shopping at the same stores, going to the same restaurant. Their kids are going to be going to the same school as my kid. We're going to be hanging out and getting stuck in the same traffic jams together. So, we're in this together, whether we like it or not. So I think we need to really, really, really figure out how how much do we want to fight with each other about this. So there's the sense in which accepting our co-journey together and thinking of each other as co-passengers as opposed to opponents in a fight.
I love that. What a perfect note to end on. If you want to improve your mental health, get rid of the otherness, right?
Yes.
Stop
Very
otherizing.
Much so. Very much so. Yes. I agree. And also, I would say one last note on the mental health bit is the best way to stop worrying about yourself is to start worrying about somebody else.
Yes.
Right? So concern for the other should replace just selfish, inward directed concern.
It does help. It really does. Very much so. Well, Samir, as always, a pleasure. We're going to talk more. We are going to check in with each other again in a few weeks. To learn more about the work of Samir Chopra, please go to samirchopra.com. You can also find him on psychologytoday.com under therapists, Samir Chopra in Brooklyn. And the book, once again, is Anxiety, a Philosophical Guide. Thank you.
Thanks very much for having me on.
Oh, my pleasure. Thanks for joining us today on Harvesting Happiness and this special edition of the Good Citizens Election Season Survival Guide, helping to restore common sense in a crazy world. If you like what you're hearing and you want more, check out more mental fitness over on Substack and Medium. This is Lisa Cypers-Kamen on behalf of my guest today, Samir Chopra, wishing you kind thoughts, kinder words, and the kindest of actions. Until next time, remember, happiness is an inside job. Happiness is your inside job. Please go out and rock your day and remember to be kind to one another. Keep harvesting your happiness anytime and anywhere from the comfort of wherever you are. Subscribe, listen, and share hundreds of downloadable Harvesting Happiness episodes from wherever you get your podcasts. Connect with and follow us on most social media channels. To learn more about lifestyle management and mental fitness services, please visit harvestinghappiness.com. Harvesting Happiness and More Mental Fitness are produced by Lisa Cypers-Kamen, Andrea Mengele, Robin Boyd, Andrea Daly, and our fantastic team at Podfly Productions, including Eric Begay, Kimberly Beck, and Alec Guess. In collaboration with TogiNet Radio, KBUU Radio Malibu, and is available on PRX, the Public Radio Exchange.